Hello everyone, and welcome to the Strategoid channel. In our last video we took a look at the Wardens, so naturally their ranged counterpart is next. If you want to learn more about possibly the best ranged unit in the game, then hang on to your 3-string bows and fill your quivers, cause here we go. As with all our guides, we look at the war scroll and abilities first. Then we move on to their role in the army and basic tactics, like selecting nations. We round off with some tips that'll give you the insight of an experienced Lumineth player. If you look at the Sentinel stat line, we see the typical Elven Militia profile. 1 wound, a move of 6 inches, a bravery of 6 and a 5+ save. They start to get fancy though when we see the values for their 3-string bows. When shooting with an Orellan bow, you choose one of the shown profiles and use those values for your attack. Aimed shots are easier to hit and have a -1 rend, but lofted arrows have a massive range of 30 inches and gain an amazing ability that we'll go into in just a minute. With their 6-inch move and lofted arrow profile, they have a threat range of 36 inches before any special abilities or spells, which is quite menacing. They can obviously also fight in melee and even hit on 3s, but their Venari daggers are nothing special. The High Sentinel fares a little better though, with her -1 rend and an extra attack, but let's just assume that you'll avoid using these weapons anyway. Just as with their Warren counterparts, their awesome strength comes from the abilities on their war scroll, rather than the weapon profiles. Orellan Sentinels are also Venari troops, and therefore gain the Shining Company ability. As long as all models touch 2 bases of other models in the same unit, they're considered to be in the Shining Company formation. Enemies attacking a Shining Company subtract 1 from their hit roll, but the company cannot run nor charge and can only pile in 1 inch. Contrary to Dawn Riders and Wardens, there's hardly ever reason enough to break this formation on your Sentinels. It's a fantastic perk to keep your archers alive longer, as it applies its -1 modifier to both ranged and melee attacks. If you've wondered why you'd ever use 3 strings on a bow, here's the reason. When they fire, their many stringed weapons ability allows them to choose one of the profiles for the entire unit. Lofted shots fly further, while aimed hits hit harder and more often. And now we're getting into the thick of it. The next ability is one of the reasons why you hear so many members of the Age of Sigmar community complain about Sentinels and even Lumineth in general. The High Sentinel can exchange her bow for a Scryhawk lantern. When she cannot draw a line of sight to an enemy unit within 30 inches, the Sentinel unit can treat that enemy as visible, even though that's actually not the case. They are obliged to use the lofted profile when they use this ability, but that's hardly a downside. Speaking of abilities that annoy the community, have you heard about the Sunmetal arrow tips that they fire? For each unmodified hit roll of 6, the attack inflicts a mortal wound instead of rolling for normal damage. Mortal wounds on ranged attacks are incredibly potent in a game where armor save stacking is prevalent. To add just a little bit extra salt to injury, their champion is also considered a wizard as long as the unit has 5 or more models. They can attempt to cast and unbind 1 spell. Most of the time, that 1 cast will be spent on their inbuilt War Scroll spell, Power of Hish. If you thought mortal wounds on 6+ to hit was nice, I'm sure you'll enjoy them even more on a 5+. When you cast this ability successfully, a third of your shots will inflict mortal wounds. That means that a unit of 10 will inflict 3 wounds in most cases, and a unit of 20 will statistically remove most small heroes in 1 volley. Take into consideration that there are several other ways to increase this unit's ranged output even further, and you start to see why they might be the best ranged unit in the game. As for their role in a Lumineth force, they're a little less flexible than Wardens. To be completely honest, you'll almost always use this unit as a hammer, but it's useful to keep all options open when playing with the Hishian elves. One of those options is to make them battle line. For each Warden unit in your army, you can make 1 Sentinel or Dawn Rider unit battle line. Since they're most effective in units of 30 models, you'll definitely want to make at least one of your Sentinel units battle line. They form the backbone of almost all competitive lists right now, and some might even say they're a bit of a crutch at the moment. As stated before, being a hammer is the role they'll fulfill most of the time for you. You want to take them in units of at least 20. Small units of 10 really don't serve any purpose, and I'd advise against taking any sentinels at all if 10 is all you take otherwise. With units of 20 or 30, you can really put on the hurt in one shooting phase, rather than needing backup from other units in your army. Especially when you pair them up with rerolls like from the Lumineth Light spell, they become a phenomenal sniper unit that can easily deal with almost all non-monster heroes. So don't go wasting your shots on normal units, and use your mortal wound output to snipe key characters to dissolve the enemy's synergy. Sentinels are obviously an excellent castle unit. There's not so much a role as a way of life, I would say, as you'll usually want to deploy them in the back of your force anyway, safely hidden behind lines of wardens and other hardy units. This playstyle also plays well into Unleash Hell. Most of the time, I end up deploying them around my Shrine Luminor, where a Cathalar will usually hand out protective spells to keep my sentinels alive longer. Lastly, it is important to remember that games are won by objective play, and not by simply killing your opponent. So even though it's usually best to keep your sentinels safe, there will be times where they are the only unit able to hold an objective. They can fulfill this role fairly well thanks to the Speed of Hish spell and the massive range on their bows. With 30-inch range on the lofted arrows, they'll still be able to contribute to the fight while holding objectives. Be mindful though that you're not cut out. Losing a sentinel unit early in the game can really cost you. Now that we've fleshed out how they act by themselves, let's see how they pair up with other units. First, we'll have a look at which nations fit them best, then go over spell selection and different kinds of deployment. Just as with the Wardens, Eumetrica really doesn't add anything to the Sentinels, which is why it retains its F grade. Syar is still top of the pack. Double Aether Quartz enables free all-out attack and defense twice. The obligatory command trait is also very techy. We'll get into it more when we cover the nations in a separate video, but it basically forces your opponent to attack your general if they're within 6 inches of him. Mind you, he could hide behind a line of wardens and sentinels, out of melee range and therefore never be attacked, while still making it impossible for your opponent to attack your sentinels. So yeah, Syar is definitely a great fit. Eliatha is also a good choice. I'd say it's slightly better for sentinels than it is for wardens, hence the A grade. I rated it this way because it gives rerolls a hit, which sentinels love, as you'll be able to dish out more mortal wounds with the ranged attacks this way. You'll also find it easier to mirror command abilities to other Vanari units close by, as sentinels usually enjoy sticking close to other ranged units. Zytrak's fantastic as well, as it increases the chance of successfully casting your most important spells, like Power of Hish and Lament Light. It's also much easier to manage than most other bonuses. As for Alumnia, well, I'm still not too keen on using this nation. Especially for a unit like Sentinels, the pre-game move really doesn't do much. Best case scenario, you get to reposition your screens or move your Sentinels further in range. With their 36 inches threat range though, I don't think it'll come up much. Now if you want to go all out on the ranged team though, there's Helen. It gives you extra shots when targeting units within 3 inches, which is fantastic for Unleash Hell. The command ability also allows the unit to disengage at the end of combat, which means you won't be stuck in combat when your opponent manages to tag you with something. I rate this nation very highly overall, but it's especially great with a lot of sentinels. We'll dive into this more in our tips and tricks section. Now let's look at some spells. Power of Hish is great and takes precedence in almost any situation, unless you really need Speed of Hish to grab an objective. As for spell selection, it's quite simple really. You can never go wrong with Speed of Hish. It's such a strong spell that you won't even mind having on several units, just in case. If you want to play your sentinels in a team with wardens, Ethereal Blessing is okay to protect him from high rend attacks, while Total Eclipse is quite good if you've not got it on anyone else. Lambent Light is a must-have when you're running a lot of Sentinels. Usually, you want to take it on different units though, which we will discuss in the tips and tricks section. To be completely honest though, this section is all well and good, but there's hardly been any time where casting Power of Hysh wasn't the obvious best choice. So I wouldn't worry too much about selecting spells on Sentinels, as you'll be casting their War Scroll spell most of the time anyway. Now for deployment. I'd recommend shielding your Sentinels with a screening unit as often as you can. Great screens are Wardens and Dawn Riders, though anything is fine in a pinch. When you're setting up though, try to keep the front line of your screen within 6 inches of as many Sentinels as possible. This way, you'll be able to squeeze out a massive Unleash Hell when your opponent charges your screening unit. The deployment of the High Sentinel is also something to keep in mind. I always try to place her somewhere where she has as little line of sight as possible. This way, I'll almost always be able to benefit from the Scryhawk Lantern. Obviously, you want to change up your deployment depending on what army you play against. It'll be a bit different every time, but as a general rule, there's only 2 types of armies you'll usually face. Ranged armies with missile weapons or magic, and melee armies with fast units and long charges. Against ranged armies, just try to stay out of line of sight. Thanks to the Scryhawk Lantern, it won't bother you at all, while your opponent will not be able to hit you back. Stay in threat range though, and keep the High Sentinel out of unbind range if possible. That way, your Power of Hysh won't be unbound. When facing melee armies like Uruks or Fire Slayers, you need to screen as best as you can. I like big bases for that, like the ones that the Dawn Riders are on, so I can cover as much ground as possible. Again, you want to keep the front of the screen within 6 inches for Unleash Hell. You could also just forgo screening and Unleash Hell with 30 Sentinels. That'll scare off or kill off most charges anyway. Just be mindful to not get caught out by any enemy pile-in moves, as this will avoid Unleash Hell. For our last part of the video, we're going to cover some tips. For the Wardens, I chose some quirky moves as they're a very flexible unit with a lot of options. Sentinels though are much more focused on simple damage output, so the tips in this video will be underlining certain methods to increase the damage even further. Our first tip is using a unit of 30 Sentinels in a Helon nation. Helon adds 1 attack to all missile weapons when targeting units within 3 inches, which means during Unleash Hell or in the combat phase. So let's just imagine your opponent charging into your 30 Sentinels. In Helon, you'd be firing 58 shots, inflicting 9 to 11 mortal wounds on average, depending on whether you've got Power of Hysh up. If you've cast Lambent Light on his units, you'll even do 20 mortals on average. Just let that sink in for a bit. Safe to say, if your opponent is not running chaff units, he might not even try charging your block of archers. Or he will, and you'll drink his tears in the perfect sunlight of Hysh. For the last 2 tips, I think it's prudent to focus on Lambent Light and how to use it well. Let me start off by clarifying that rerolls are key to guaranteeing mortal wounds. Therefore, you really want Lambent Light in your army, or the Iliatha reroll to a lesser extent. Rerolling is especially good because you can fish for mortal wounds. This means that you should reroll all dice that did not inflict mortal wounds, even the ones that hit. Trying again for a mortal wound is more effective than rolling 2 wound and then hoping your opponent will fail his save roll. Having rerolls is even better than having Power of Hysh. So when you're given a choice between casting Power of Hysh or Lambent Light, you should always opt for the latter. Of course, you'll normally never have to make this choice, as you should take Lumineth Light on other units, which, incidentally, is our last tip. A Lore Seeker is a good choice to take Lumineth Light on. Their ability to deploy outside of your deployment zone usually gets them within range of 18 inches. You'll be able to cast it in the first turn and then start peppering them with rerolling mortals from the get-go. Along the same vein, we have the Lord Regent in Alumnia. As we've said before, this is not a very useful nation for Sentinels, but it does open up some shenanigans, like this one. Basically, you move up your Lord Regent 16 inches with a pre-game move, cast Lumineth Light during your first turn, then move him back all the way during your movement phase. This is only a viable tactic when you've got the initiative during the first turn though. Lastly, you could always have Wardens or Dawn Riders as your Lumineth Light caddies. Honestly, I usually have it on one of these units, depending on which ones I have no specific use for, except for being there. Of course, you'll want to move that unit, so don't select a unit that you want guarding your castle. And with that, we've come to the end of this in-depth guide on the Lumineth Sentinels. We hope you've enjoyed watching this video and that you'll show off your Sentinel skills in your next battle. Please leave us a like if you enjoyed this video and feel free to share and subscribe. It really helps out the channel and I've loved hearing all your feedback, it's such a great time. Our next video will be on the Dawn Riders and we'll also be posting a video on how to play against Lumineth. So that'll be interesting. So stay tuned and see you later.